Now we're just going to move on to our next session, which is around the areas of knowledge subgroup. As Darren mentioned, the areas of knowledge subgroup is a fundamental pillar of the Asian Legal Network, as it's the community engagement, research and advocacy wing of the ALN. So our next session, which is being presented by Alvian, Sim, Don and Amarant, will go into more details about the AOK, as well as introduce you to various aspects of the research, methodologies and challenges going forward. So I'm just going to bring up the slide and then you guys can jump into it. Okay. Hold on. Maybe there. Just cycle through. Just space. We'll do it again, man. As well. Should be right down. Oh. Session 4. Okay, all right, over to you guys.
Perfect. Kia ora koutou katoa. Thank you, Teja, for the introduction. My name is Alvin Benitez. I'm a final year student here at Te Herenga Waka, and it is my absolute pleasure to get the ALN Areas of Knowledge Group presentation started today. And as Teja said, we are the research and advocacy wing of the ALN, and hopefully by the end of this, you'll have a better insight of who we are, what we do, and how we'll do it. Oopsie, not that one yet. Well, I seem to have skipped the introduction slide, but I'll just take it from there. So as I said, my name is Alvian. I whakapapa back to the Philippines. I moved here at a very young age, and we here are the steering group. So we've done the mahi on this presentation and the planning days thus far, and the organization and the plan going into the future, which you'll hear about. So I'll let the others introduce themselves.
So, kia ora ni semua benakan I Sim o yang long you know the VT. My name is Sim and I'm originally from Fiji and I whakapapa back to Fiji, South Africa and India as well, and I'm super excited to be part of this kaupapa.
Kia ora, my name is Amarant. I whakapapa back to Cambodia. You'll be hearing from me afterwards in the scholarship section, so I'll hand over to Don.
Ahiahi Marie, ko Aotearoa tōku whenua, ko te moana nui a kiwa tōku moana, no haina o nā tupuna no Singapore a hou, ke whanganui a tara e noho ana, ko lai tōku whanau, ko Don taku ingoa. Kia ora everyone, my name is Don. I grew up in Singapore, moved to Aotearoa, New Zealand when I was 16, ended up studying in University of Auckland, and currently living in Wellington, and I further whakapapa back to China.
Kia ora. Thanks for that. So, oops, I'm just going to admit there. So why do we need the AOK? So the other arms of the Asian Legal Network need a way of identifying issues that face our communities in order to have a focused approach to their work. This has been touched on by every presentation so far. So explaining by way of analogy, if you will, in a waka, there are multiple seats for multiple paddlers. At the center of the waka is the seat of the engine room, described to be the strong paddler that pushes the waka forward while working with the rest of the team. So think of the AOKs, the Areas of Knowledge Group, as that engine room seat in our ALN waka, working with the guidance of the planning group and the organizing team to execute that 20-year plan that Darren spoke of. There is currently no Asian methodology or researching body for identifying issues facing Asian peoples in Aotearoa, New Zealand. That is what the Areas of Knowledge Group aims to be. The group that fills in that lack with community input at its core. And you might ask yourself, well, how will our research be different from other groups? There are already other groups doing what we purport to do. Well, currently, we see research as a space dominated by scholars and academics and by traditionally Western research techniques, such as trawling through books and texts with little community engagement. And where there is community engagement, it's often for data and does no justice to lived experiences. This is our starting point. The AOKs seek to change how we think about research. We believe that research is all about the community. This is the core assumption that underlies kaupapa Māori research, and special thanks to Don for his detailed introductory memo on this subject, which he shared with the group in Methodologies Day 1, which I'm sure he will speak further to. Our research will involve Asian people as individuals and communities, and should set out to make a positive difference for the research, those sharing their lived experiences on any particular topic. As per Kaupapa Maori, the research approach must therefore address working with communities and involve sharing processes and knowledge. We acknowledge that we have a lot to learn from one another, and research, in our view, can be a two-way relationship of knowledge sharing and mutual respect. And that is the point of difference that we wish to present to you today. Those who have been involved with the AOKs thus far don't know or claim to know what the community wants and needs. And this is why we need to include the community from the very start. For without constant and genuine community engagement, we risk not utilizing ALN time and resources efficiently and risk coming up with so-called solutions that benefit nobody, or even worse, the privileged few. The AOKs seek to incorporate these kaupapa Māori processes, such as networking, community consultations, and whānau research groups, which assist in bringing into focus the problems that are significant for Asians. And you will see how the AOKs have already begun doing that. We want to change the framing of research. Research can be as simple as having a coffee with a kaumatua or inviting someone to a hui to learn. And the end goal of this, as Darren mentioned, is to build an Asian jurisprudence in line with the ALN's purpose. And while this sounds overly academic, all it means is that we're looking to fill the gap, as per the previous slide, that exists in the literature, right? Currently, it doesn't address us or the issues that we face. And you can actually see us working now to try and fill that gap through Jess, Amrin, and Etienne's 7-minute thesis presentation coming up after this. Their work highlights that there is room for traditionally Western research methods alongside community-focused approaches. The two are not mutually exclusive. It is the job of the AOKs to marry that together. And we seek to develop a methodology for scholars and your community alike. So that covers why we need the AOK group and what the AOK group is seeking to do. Research for positive results on those researched. But how do we actually do this? How will we use the knowledge and sharing of the community and integrate that into what we've spoken of today? Well, the process can be viewed in 3 overlapping parts, as you can see on screen. Research, or knowledge gathering, education, and advocacy. So let's take the issue of immigration as an example to bring you through that. First and foremost is to engage the community. This would involve inviting those who have gone through the immigration process, for example, to speak to their lived experiences, while being sensitive and accommodating of the fact that these are not light topics. This knowledge gathering phase might also include talking to those who are experts in immigration law and law reform. And linking back to traditional research techniques, as I already mentioned, it can also involve close reading of legislation and text, analyzing the black letter law as it is. But the community is the heart of it, the middle seat of that waka. Secondly, if we look to the education phase, the process of getting to advocacy is one that we seek to co-design, highlighted by a process of education. The approach is not to tell people what we will do, but to ask people and work with communities so that they can actively and meaningfully engage, feeding in the knowledge to the AOKs so that we are not just sitting in our ivory towers researching problems that nobody actually has. By publishing and encouraging feedback in our work and showing how we have used their whakaaro, their concerns, the community can hold us accountable. The intention is to know our community well enough where this accountability mechanism is a strong one. And thirdly, we move to synthesize this knowledge, feedback, and discussion. Having gone through the co-designed and iterative processes, that is when we utilize the information practically as a mechanism for advocacy. So as you can see here, that might mean intervening in court cases, submitting on bills to select committees, compiling reports on Asians facing Asian communities. But even more simply than that, it also means being there for one another in the spaces where we have often been misrepresented or underrepresented. Hopefully through the process we've outlined so far, you can see how we intend to achieve our goal. We are building off of this starting point, and the more people we have in the AOKs moving forward will only improve and develop it further. And I'll pass on to Sim to speak on what we've done so far.
Kia ora, Alvin. So you must be wondering, what is the mahi that we've been involved with to get to our end goal? I'll just flip to that. Thank you. Awesome. So what have we done so far? So as you can see on the timeline, we started off with meeting 1, meeting 2, which alluded into methodologies 1 and 2. Now, prior to meeting 1, we had that beginning conversation about what is the areas of knowledge, what is our role, what is our purpose. So it was just that floating ideas, and we tried to capture them together. We met up with Judge Margaret Lee, who is the first Asian judge in New Zealand, and then this led into our first meeting, the areas of knowledge, which was on the 26th of August last year. This was held at Dr. Ruping's house, who is a lecturer here at Te Heringawaka in the law faculty. This was more of a whakawhanaungatanga, so trying to get to know each other and our whakapapa and what we value in our lives and why we are here to support this kaupapa. It was very nice, very wholesome. We had some kai. Darren got his famous chicken, which is very lovely. So it was a very, very nice time to get to know each other, and it was the basic introductions. So our second meeting of areas of knowledge was held on the 6th of November last year, and this was where we thought about how our areas of knowledge subgroup fits in with the rest of the ALN group. And this is where we found our purpose. So now we'll hand over to Don, who will talk about the methodologies.
Thank you, Sim and Albion. So I'm just going to briefly talk about what we did in the 2 methodologies meetings. In day 1, what we had was a presentation on our Pākehā methodologies, or the methodologies which have been traditionally used by our government agencies, such as the Law Commission. We looked at, how have these government agencies gone about consultation, for example. And then the next presentation we had was on Indigenous kaupapa Māori methodologies, or decolonizing methodologies, not to suggest that they're the same thing. And so what we did looking at these 2 lenses or frameworks, I think, was to draw from them lessons and values which we can use to inform and build our own Asian methodologies. And that really brings me to the next point, I suppose, which is on the centrality of methodology. And what we mean by methodology broadly, what we're referring to here is the approach taken towards research. But what we are talking to specifically today is the context in which research problems are conceptualized and the implications of them for communities. As I sort of alluded to earlier, what we are concerned with here is developing methodologies specifically tailored for Asian communities and our issues. And you might ask, why is this important? So this is a really powerful quote that I came across when I was reading Decolonizing Methodologies by Linda Tui Weiss-Smith. And that is, research is not done in the abstract. It is carried out by people who in some shape or way have been trained and socialized into ways of thinking. And so what this means is that if you think of your typical researcher perhaps, or typical Asian law student, we have been through law school. We have been schooled in very particular ways of thinking. And these are not necessarily appropriate lens in which to view Asian issues. What we as Asians need to do is to fashion our own tools, our own methodologies. It is not a categorical rejection of Pākehā methodologies, but rather it is a recognition that we as Asian communities, we need to find our own voice, or a way of voicing our concerns, our fears, desires, aspirations, needs, and questions. So as I alluded to before, it is neither appropriate nor helpful necessarily to use the methodologies developed by other communities other than those we have developed ourselves and for our communities. And as this quote by Kathy Owen appositely says, real power lies with those who design the tools. And so what we want to here is to design the tools for our communities. So how we will do it. So this sort of brings us back to the 2 meetings on methodologies which we have had. As we were sort of going through the process of thinking about different methodologies and the ways of approaching them, we realized that we couldn't meaningfully separate the question of methodologies from the question of identity. And what this means is that we need to develop our ideas on these 2 simultaneously and let both of them inform our work. So the question is, what does it mean to be Asian, or more specifically, what does it mean to be Asian in Aotearoa? And of course, as we go about exploring questions of identity, that needs to be informed by a specific methodology at the same time. And so what I'm going to do now is to take you to some of the principles and values which will inform our draft methodologies going forward. And so these are some of the ideas which came out from our discussions on methodologies as well as in our previous meetings. As you can see, at the very center is the community, and that is to signify that it is at the heart of everything that we do. Control of our work will be shared with our communities and must receive the support of our communities. This means that we start with the community in mind, stay close to the ground the entire process, and then come back again to our communities at the end of the process. And then we also see all these other principles that revolve around this idea of a community-centric methodology. And I don't mean to suggest that all these principles sit in isolation, they all interrelate. So for example, process-oriented on the right-hand side of the screen, top right-hand side of the screen. In all community approaches, process is extremely important, and usually it's far more important than the outcome itself. So what we're looking at here, doing within the areas of knowledge group, is consultation, collective meetings, open debate, and shared decision-making with our communities. And then we have another important bubble, intersectionality. Our work will be done with a keen awareness to the dangers of homogenizing Asian identity. And we have to be cautious as to allowing certain communities, larger communities, dominate the conversation. And this is a point that Alvin will return to again subsequently. Another thing, positionality. And this returns to the idea that we need to have a keen awareness of our own assumptions and our values cultural orientations that we bring to our work. So I speak for myself, when I do my research, it's an inevitable consequence that I speak from my perspective and position as a recent Asian immigrant to Aotearoa who grew up in a predominantly Chinese background in Singapore, a former British colony, and who comes from a privileged background, having the opportunity to study law and working as a judge's clerk. And all of these ideas of positionality that we bring to our work, that ties into that attitude of reflectivity, self-reflectivity, and reflexivity. And this means being prepared to recognize our own privilege, my own privilege in my work, and being aware of how that shapes my thinking. And that also ties into the next idea, which is that of accountability. And as Alvin said, we need to start with the central tenet that any research that we do needs to start out with the assumption that we benefit our community. And if we don't actually do that, then it's not really research, but it's more of like a self exercise. We need to make a positive difference for those who are researched. And that also entails taking a tailored approach to our work. And finally, and most importantly, as we have heard from numerous speakers today, our work will be about whakawhanaungatanga, about fostering transformative relationships of solidarity within the Asian community, but more importantly, with tangata whenua, with Te Moana Nui Akiwa, and with the whenua. And so this is an affirmation to you that the work that the areas of knowledge do and the knowledge that we gather, it will be treated and done consistently and respectfully of tangata whenua and of the wider decolonization project. As Justice Joe said very movingly earlier today, it's about empowering the Māori narrative. And we see here an opportunity for a coalition between the Asian communities and the other communities of Aotearoa, where we can empower each of us to be what we need to be, all while being seduced by the whenua, as he said. We are all Polynesian. And so perhaps to talk briefly about the values which we have identified, and this is about the ethos which we bring towards our work. So for example, we have respect. And this is the idea that research processes need to be respectful to enable people and the communities to respect and enhance community processes, to heal and to educate. And so I just want to share with you briefly a set of responsibilities identified by Ngauia Te Awe Hotuku. These are ethical principles of research in Māori communities, but I found these are extremely inspirational and they also shape the way that we think and extend these values. So for example, aroha ki te tangata, a respect for the people that is the heart of what that we do. Kawa e takahia te mana o te tangata, be careful not to trample on the mana of the people. And a few others as well. For example, te kiro whakarongo kōrero. And that is the idea that we listen and we look first and we hesitate before we put our voice forward. And that's because we need to hear and genuinely listen to the voice of the community. And so a lot of these other values that we have here, like perseverance, for instance, courage, perseverance, because in this space, the work that we do, it will never be fully right. And that is okay. And what is the most important that is we keep trying to do the right thing by our communities and for our people. And that also leans into questions, the importance of courage, because a lot of the things that we're exploring here, they are unexplored ones, and that inherently comes with a lot of uncertainty. Questions of identity, privilege, all of these are very confronting ideas. I myself speak for myself where, coming to accept my own privilege and acknowledging that this is something that I have, that was something that was a deeply uncomfortable sort of situation. But what is important is that we do it together as a community, and that we afi and we hold space for each other as we explore these questions together. So I'm just going to talk briefly about areas of law that we've identified. And so as Sim has spoken to earlier, we came up with a community document which we shared with the wider ALN community, as well as sought thoughts and advice from people outside the Asian community as well. And so what you see here today will be 10 areas of law. They're not everything that we have, but they provide a snapshot of the areas which we are interested in and that we would like to develop further. So just to focus on the first one, and perhaps the dominant question that has been dominating this entire conference, and that is the idea of Te Tiriti or Waitangi constitutional law, the question of where do Asians fit in constitutional transformation? What do our Asian communities want? And these are questions which we don't have easy answers to, but it's important as we think about the 40-year treaty signing anniversary that we start to think of these ideas so that we have things prepared going into that conversation. And so I'll just hand over quickly to Albion, who's going to speak briefly about intersectionality.
Yeah, so as Don mentioned, this is an issue that permeates all of the areas of law that you're going to see today. And it kind of questions what the power dynamics are between different intersection Asian communities. So currently the label Asian, we know is a very diverse one, and we know hides a lot of smaller populations within it. So last year, Sim and I had the privilege of being interviewed by One News to the Asian Law Students Association on whether we think the term is harmful or not. And something that we found is that perhaps we want to look at issues that aren't commonly spoken of, like how the label of Asian affects the delivery of mental health services, for example, because we see a domination of like maybe larger Southeast Asian ethnicity groups clouding the data. And even to a less harmful but still very relevant outcome of that is when we're trying to develop an Asian jurisprudence. What does that even mean? So it's inherently an intersectional issue to even approach it the way that we have.
Thanks, Albion. I'll just speak very briefly about access to justice. So this is an area which our Chief Justice has spoken quite a bit about. And I think it's a particular issue, for example, up in Auckland with a large population of Asians. And that is a question of translation issues, evidential issues. And I think the fundamental question that we're looking at here is how do we create a dispute resolution system that recognizes and is inclusive of Asian cultural values and norms. So this is a wider question, and it does back the question of why we want this in the first place. But these are some of the things that we're looking at. And no doubt issues of translation, evidence, those are real issues that confront our courts every day. Perhaps to talk about one more thing. So just to briefly talk about human rights. So this is our fourth area. So once again, as we have heard from speakers earlier today, human rights is a very individualized, very Western sort of way of viewing things at least at the present moment. And so the question is, can these human rights, these pakeha constructs, I suppose, can they really provide redress for Asian communities and for other communities, such as, for example, for Tangata Whenua? And now I think we will, so these are the 5 areas which are perhaps more intersectional and broader in terms of approach. We're going to identify another 5 areas as well. And these are areas in which, are perhaps more typical. You look at criminal law, you look at family law. And just to speak briefly to criminal law, this is a big issue because we know that Asian immigrant communities, they face issues of domestic violence, social isolation, translation issues. And these are very big issues faced by victims of sexual and domestic abuse. This is also another very important area that we would like to look at. So I'll just pass over to Albion, who'll speak about family law.
Yeah, so as Don mentioned, the issue of domestic abuse and domestic violence is one that affects all communities, unfortunately. And there are some Asian-specific questions that we can be asking with regard to this area of law. Like, how can our family law legislation be better adapted to protect Asian children and their cultural considerations going through the family dispute resolution process? And how do Asian family dynamics inform our approach to addressing domestic violence? And perhaps more imminently, how can we make it so our diversity within the Asian label is reflected in the family courts, in the judges, and who's being represented in the lawyers? And how do we make sure that they are culturally safe and hold and understand the nuances of the different cultures and the significance on something like relationship property, for example?
Awesome. Now I'll just lead into immigration and refugee law, which is something I can personally talk to. So I'm an immigrant. I moved when I was 17, so not too long ago. And this made me question, where do I fit in laws of Aotearoa? And I'm pretty sure most of us maybe are immigrants as well, or may relate to our families being first, second, or third generations in Aotearoa as well. And there's questions like, do Asian peoples have the right to be in Aotearoa? Are there any attached obligations? And what treatment do Asians or immigrants, refugees get compared to non-Asians as well? And this kind of relates to point 10, which talks about, which we look at employment law. So immigrants at workplaces, like what are their rights and what do they stand for? What are they entitled to in a workplace as well? So it's kind of important, not kind of, it is very important to view things from a te tiriti lens as well. So the principle of good faith and partnership. So we can, so we can like lead into that and relate that into immigration and refugee law as well as employment law as well. And this kind of reminds me of something that I was told over my summer internship about being bus and being in that basket of knowledge that we have. So we all come from our baskets of knowledge, and we also staying in a Western law society, there's also that Gucci bag compared to that woven bag that we have. So we have our knowledge, we are all talented and they have our own gifts. So we have something to give to every place that we go to. So taking things from our woven bags and baskets to our Gucci bags, basically. Kind of went on a tangent, but yeah, that's about
all for it.
So, all right, so yeah, so where do we go from here? So what you're looking at right now on the timeline is where we are right now. So that's March this year, which is our online Hui launch. So welcome everybody. So from here, our main question or something to keep at the forefront of our minds is, who is our public? Like, who is our audience? Who are we as members and what do we want? So keeping community at the forefront of our minds, and community engagement is what we want out of it. So from April to June this year, we're aiming to host ALN-wide identity sessions where we can all come together and brainstorm on our areas of laws and also things that we are passionate about. There will also be workshops and also reaching out to community to get more of that community engagement going. From July to September, we have an areas of knowledge focused methodology session. So kind of looking at the methodology papers that were released by Don and our amazing people in ALN as well, and more workshopping. And then in November this year, we have discussion papers on identity and methodologies. Now, this discussion papers is our starting point. This is where we want to get feedback, and this is the start of our community engagement. The discussion papers on identity and methodologies will provoke that thought that we need to move forward. And there, we are planning to get guest speakers from Tangata Whenua and Pasifika as well to get that core elements of our community. So, as I mentioned before, from April to June, we're looking at having ALN-wide identity sessions and workshopping. So you must be wondering, what does this consist of? So we're planning to have introductory sessions, which will be 1.5 hours each, looking at the history of Asian peoples in Aotearoa, Asian American critical race theory, te tiriti o Waitangi, multiculturalism and biculturalism, geopolitics, rise of Asia. And through this, we will expand more on our identity and the sessions and workshops that were aforementioned, and how can you watching get involved with us as well. So our 2-hour workshops will be looking at crafting our identities, and we will be using these discussion papers to get community to kick in so we can get the ball rolling kind of vibe. And then also we're looking at community engagement, as I had mentioned before.
Yes. Oh. We had a meme, a very good meme about why you should join the Areas of Knowledge group. But like, genuinely, please If you've resonated with some stuff that we've said here today, especially if you're a student, I know that there's some ALSA members out there. This really is a good way to get involved, and it is helpful for your studies. So it's kind of a selfish thing in there too. But thank you so much for listening to us and for giving us the time to share our mahi with you all. Kia ora.
Kia ora.